Seattle rain falls one drop at a time, steady and patient. The smell of cheap coffee blends with damp earth while the streetcar hums in the background. My name is Logan Vance. I am 46 years old, a senior operations specialist at Apex Dynamics, and this morning I was busy avoiding puddles. I have been here for 8 years. That is long enough to know that when a corporation boasts about its positive work culture, it is just a nice way of saying everyone is exhausted. Apex Dynamics is famous for its growth rate, and equally famous for managers who talk more than they work. I have lost count of the detailed operations reports I have written that my supervisor later presented as his own. But this morning I was running late and had no time to dwell on it. As I crossed the asphalt parking lot, I noticed a man bent over near the loading dock, trying to fix a stubborn piece of mechanical equipment under the cold downpour. His dark gray work uniform was completely soaked through, his heavy gloves were covered in dark grease, and his shoulders were hunched in a way that looked all too familiar. The sigh he let out seemed to disappear directly into the damp air. Stopped. Something about his posture and the quiet way he worked reminded me of my father. My father was a factory hand who spent 40 years doing hard, manual labor without once complaining. He was a quiet, enduring man who believed that work was something you did with your head down. I opened my canvas bag, pulled out my foil-wrapped turkey sandwich, and the insulated cup of coffee I had just bought. It was the standard breakfast of guys who start their workday before their paycheck actually makes it worthwhile. "Have you had a chance to eat yet?" I asked, stepping closer to him. "It is freezing out here." "You should not be working on an empty stomach." The man looked up at me. He seemed genuinely surprised for a second, his brow furrowing as he wiped a smear of grease from his cheek. Then he gave me a slow, quiet nod. There was no big thank you, no polite small talk. He just accepted the coffee and the sandwich. But there was a look in his eyes, a steady, calm focus, that made me feel strangely at peace. I walked toward the entrance, feeling like today was going to be different. The strong scent of George Miller's expensive cologne hit me the moment I stepped inside. George was my direct supervisor, a manager who demanded attention. He arrived daily like he was stepping onto a stage, with slicked hair and a smile wide enough to deceive anyone in a quarterly shareholder meeting. 12 minutes late, George said, his voice echoing across the open cubicles. "Do you think the business is going to pause its operations just for you, Logan?" I hung my coat. "No, George," I said, "but the world will keep turning without us." He frowned and turned on his heel. I sat down and booted my computer, the fan humming in complaint. Outside the window, the rain kept coming down in sheets. Inside, the sound of keyboards clicking filled the room, sounding like a collective, tired heartbeat. I glanced at the calendar on my screen. I had less than 10 minutes before the big welcome meeting for our new chief executive officer. George had been talking about this day for the past 2 weeks, with a strange nervous energy, almost as if he were the one being promoted instead of just introducing the new boss. I ran a hand through my damp hair, adjusted the collar of my blue shirt, and walked down the long, bright hallway. The bright white lights bounced off the polished floor, stinging my eyes. When I reached the elevator, I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflective metal door. I looked tired, but I was still standing. 8 years in this place, and I had learned how to keep my frustrations locked away. The conference room was on the 21st floor. 14 people were already seated around the long mahogany table when I entered. George was standing near the projection screen, holding a leather folder and smiling so hard his jaw looked stiff. He shot me a sharp look. The kind of look that warned me if I made a single sound, he would find a way to deduct it from my next paycheck. I took a seat at the far end of the table. It was the safest spot in the room. It was far enough to avoid being called on, but close enough to hear everything. "We are just waiting for one more person to arrive," George said, his voice loud and rehearsed. I opened my notepad and wrote down a single line. "Get ready for a long speech about teamwork." Then the heavy glass door swung open. The sound of firm footsteps echoed on the carpet. I looked up, and my heart stopped. A man walked into the room wearing a tailored dark suit and a clean white shirt. His hair was still slightly damp from the rain outside. His eyes scanned the long table, then stopped right where I was sitting. It was only for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. He remembered me, George did not notice a thing. He rushed forward, extending his hand with his voice rising. "Welcome to Apex Dynamics, Mr. Sean O'Neill," George said. "We are incredibly honored to have you lead us." I sat there in silence. The glass of water on the table in front of me reflected the image of the man I had just shared my breakfast with in the cold rain. He was our new chief executive officer. The air in the 21st floor conference room felt heavy, like a pot of coffee that had been left on the burner for too long. The glow from a dozen laptops lit up the faces of the department heads, and George Miller's cologne was thick enough to make your eyes water. He stood at the head of the mahogany table, shoulders squared and his teeth showing in a smile that was clearly meant for the corporate newsletter rather than the actual people sitting in the room. "I am incredibly pleased to introduce our core operations group to Mr. O'Neill," George said, stretching out his words as if he were introducing a television show about his own achievements. Every sentence had a practiced rhythmic quality to it. He sounded confident, maybe a little too theatrical, but if you had spent enough time in these offices, you could hear the thin line of nervous tension underneath his voice. Sean O'Neill, the man who had been standing in the rain just an hour ago, sat quietly at the head of the table. The gray light from the window touched the shoulder of his dark suit, highlighting his calm, expressionless face. Watching him, I realized that his silence was not just passive. It was the silence of a man who was taking in every detail, measuring the room without saying a word. George launched into his presentation, talking at length about our growth strategy, optimization metrics, and the overall health of our division. He used terms that were shiny enough to keep anyone from asking what he actually did all day. When he reached the section on team structure and individual contributions, he gave a brief, casual nod in my direction. "Logan handles the basic administrative work and the technical details," George said, his voice flat. "He is very meticulous, though he tends to be a bit slow with his execution." I kept my head up and offered a polite, empty smile. Nobody said anything, but I noticed Sean's eyes drift toward me for a second, before he looked back down at the folder in front of him. He did not interrupt George. None of us did. We had all learned the hard way that speaking up at the wrong time in a meeting like this was an easy way to end up on the receiving end of an unpleasant performance review. George finished his speech with a self-satisfied chuckle. "I believe that under my direct supervision, this department has become a model of efficiency and high performance." Anyone who had ever spent an hour on the operations floor knew that statement was about as accurate as a motivational quote on a break-room wall. Sean set his pen down on the table and nodded once. "Thank you, George. That was an interesting presentation." His voice was low and steady, with no dramatic peaks or valleys, but every word seemed to carry a lot of weight. He turned a page in his folder and spoke clearly. "I would like you to send the raw financial data and the project logs behind these summary charts directly to my office. I want to take a closer look at the operating costs." George hesitated for a split second, his smile freezing for just a frame before he recovered. "Of course, Mr. O'Neill," he said quickly. "I will have Logan put that package together for you today. He knows where all the spreadsheets are kept." I gave a small nod of agreement, even though George did not bother to look at me. I was used to this pattern, doing the actual labor while he took the credit. But this time, something felt different. Sean looked directly at me, his gaze firm and deliberate. "Good," he said. "I will look forward to reviewing those details." The meeting ended, and people immediately began filtering out into the hallway, trading the usual empty pleasantries that nobody actually believed. George walked past my desk a few minutes later, tapping his leather folder against his leg like a man who had just won a prize. "See, Logan," George said with a smirk. "Image is everything. The details are just background noise." I smiled and did not argue. Image was indeed the only thing George had, and nobody in the building was interested in buying it anymore. By the middle of the afternoon, the first official email from the chief executive's office hit my inbox. It was a formal request to audit all vendor contracts, operational expenses, and internal approvals from the past 9 months. I stared at the screen, feeling the air in my lungs grow quiet. It was not fear. It was just that familiar feeling you get right before a storm rolls in. The kind of storm that does not make a lot of noise, but manages to blow away anything that is not bolted down. George appeared at my cubicle entrance, a few minutes later, his smile looking tighter than usual. "Logan, I need you to help with some routine checks for Mr. O'Neill's request. Just make sure the files are tidy. We do not want any unnecessary questions." I looked at him and gave a slow nod. "I am always thorough, George," I said quietly. "Do you want the actual numbers or just the version you presented this morning?" He did not answer. He just turned and walked away, his leather shoes clicking loudly against the tile floor, leaving behind another wave of his heavy cologne. I opened the main network drive and started pulling up the expense directories. In the reflection of the black monitor, I could see my own face, and I knew I was about to start a process that would change everything. I used to think that major corporate scandals always started with something dramatic, like a shouting match in the boardroom or an accidental email sent to the entire company. But the truth is, they usually start very quietly, like an air conditioning unit that slowly stops working until everyone in the office realizes the room has grown cold. After that morning meeting, the atmosphere at Apex Dynamics changed. Nobody talked about it openly, but you could feel the shift in the air. It felt as though the entire system had been switched over to a different mode, where every transaction and every line of code was being monitored. The first formal email from the internal audit team arrived on Wednesday morning. The subject line was simple: review of operational expenditures for the second and third quarters. It requested all raw ledger entries to be submitted by the end of the week. The message was sent to me, with George Miller copied on the thread. But I knew George would not read past the first few lines. George was not the kind of manager who read long emails. He was the kind of manager who forwarded them to his subordinates with a note telling them to handle it. Later that afternoon, George walked into my workspace. His tie was slightly crooked, and his cologne was even stronger than usual, as if he were trying to mask the scent of his own anxiety. "Logan, I need you to run a quick query on our vendor payments for the last 3 major projects," he said, keeping his voice low. "Specifically, the accounts for Zenith, Quantum, and Apex. Do it as quickly as possible." I did not need to open the database to know about those projects. They were names that only existed on George's colorful slide presentations. There was no actual work associated with them. "What specific filters do you want me to apply, George?" I asked, keeping my voice completely flat. George's eyes flicked toward the door, a classic sign of a man who was trying to construct a lie on the spot. "Just check the payment dates and the approval signatures," he said. "That should be enough." I nodded, but in my mind, I had already opened a private directory on my secure system titled Archive Backup. That evening, I stayed at my desk long after the rest of the staff had gone home. The printer in the corner hummed softly, and the rain continued to beat against the large windows. I pulled up the expense reports for the past 9 months. Line by line, the transactions began to appear on my screen, cold and undeniable. A consulting firm named Summit Consulting Group had received a total of $370,000. There was no contract file attached to their vendor profile, and no deliverables were listed in the system. The money had been sent in 3 separate transactions: $145,000, $130,000, and $95,000. Every single one of those payments had been approved using the executive clearance code belonging to George Miller. I sat there, my hand gripping the mouse until my knuckles turned white. I was not surprised. I had suspected something like this for a long time. What made me feel cold was the realization that I had been the one formatting these reports, aligning the columns, and making the data look clean for the quarterly reviews. Without knowing it, I had helped present the lies as truth. I stood up, walked to the break room, and poured myself a glass of water. The cold water did not ease the tightness in my chest. I went back to my desk and began copying everything: mails, change logs, database entries, and system drafts. I took 3 separate copies. One went onto an external drive, one went onto my personal machine at home, and the third was uploaded to an encrypted cloud folder that I hid under a directory named Blueberry Pie Recipe 1999. The next morning, George came in trying to act like his usual self. He patted my shoulder and offered a tight smile. "We are a team, Logan," he said. You and me. We look out for each other, right? I just nodded, keeping my expression entirely neutral. By lunch, the rumors were moving through the office like wildfire. People were whispering that the new chief executive officer had been asking about my work and that we had spoken privately. It did not take long for the Human Resources Department to call me in. The HR representative looked uncomfortable as she sat across from me. Logan, we have had some concerns raised about your sudden access to the executive suite, she said. We want to clear this up before it turns into gossip. I kept my voice calm. I am just doing the work I was asked to do. Before she could respond, the door opened and Sean O'Neill walked in. His presence was quiet but completely commanding. I asked Logan to assist me because of his years of experience and his direct knowledge of our operations, Sean said, his voice cutting through the tension. If there are any questions about his authority, they should be directed to my office. The HR manager apologized immediately and ended the meeting. Once she left, Sean turned to me. I know what it is like to be positioned as the scapegoat, Logan, he said softly. I spent years watching bad managers take credit for my work while I took the fall for their mistakes. I am here to fix this company, and I need people who value the truth. Looking at him, I realized he was not just a corporate suit. He was a man who had earned his scars the hard way, and he understood the cost of silence. The tension in the office had become so thick, you could almost feel it press against your temples. People were moving quietly between their cubicles, avoiding eye contact, and the usual hallway chatter had completely died down. Even the sound of the copy machine felt louder than it should have been, like a hammer hitting an anvil in a quiet room. I walked to my desk, my damp jacket doing nothing to keep out the chill that seemed to be coming from the building itself. When I logged into the network, my screen flicked. The folders containing the 9-month expense audits were gone. The subdirectory titled Q2O Audit was completely empty. The system logs showed that the files had been purged from the central server late the previous night. I sat back in my chair. I could almost picture George Miller sitting alone in his office in the dark, sweat soaking through his shirt as he typed the deletion commands, believing that removing the digital files would somehow erase the path of his fraud. But he had no idea that I had already secured 3 separate backups. Around 9 in the morning, George walked into my workspace. He did not knock. He came in, closed the door behind him, and turned the lock. The click of the lock sounded like the start of a confrontation. His eyes were bloodshot. His tie was loose, and he looked like he had not slept in 48 hours. But he was still trying to project an air of authority. Logan, we need to work together on this, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I know you have copies of the ledger files. If you stand with me, I will make sure you are taken care of when the reorganization happens. But if I go down, I will make sure they know you were the one who authorized the ledger entries. Do you honestly think Sean O'Neill is going to protect a senior specialist when the lawyers get involved? I looked at him, my fingers resting quietly on my desk. His breathing was shallow, and I could smell the stale coffee and stress on him. I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He wanted to split the blame, to make me a co-conspirator in his scheme. It was the same tactic he had used 2 years ago on a junior analyst who ended up resigning in tears. He had promised to protect her too, right before he handed HR a file that blamed her for his own budgeting errors. But I was not that analyst. I had spent 8 years learning how to document every transaction, save every email confirmation, and cover my own tracks with meticulous detail. You are right about one thing, George, I said. I have spent 8 years being ignored and doing the work that you claimed as your own. But you are wrong if you think I need your protection. I paid my debt to you with years of quiet, hard work and long nights fixing your mistakes. I do not owe you anything else. George stared at me, his face turning red. You are making a massive mistake, Logan, he hissed. You have no idea how this industry works. He unlocked the door and slammed it behind him. The sound rattled the glass partition. At 2 in the afternoon, a company-wide email from the executive office arrived. All hands meeting. Tomorrow morning at 9 in the morning. Attendance is mandatory. I spent the rest of the day finalizing the report. I did not just list the transactions. I compiled the entire legal framework. I cited the Revised Code of Washington, Section 23B.08.300. Under Washington law, a corporate director or officer has a strict fiduciary duty of care, loyalty, and good faith. By directing $370,000 of corporate funds to a shell entity like Summit Consulting Group, without a contract or any business purpose, George had committed a clear breach of fiduciary duty, corporate waste, and self-dealing. I wrote out the explanation clearly, detailing how the statutory provisions of Section 23B.08.300 apply to unauthorized self-dealing transactions. I attached the banking records, the system logs showing the approval codes, and the forensic trails of the files that had been deleted the night before. I sent the final document directly to Sean O'Neill through our encrypted channel. My hand was steady as I clicked the send button. I did not feel angry or eager for a fight. I just felt a quiet sense of resolution. For 8 years, I had watched men like George run the company into the ground, taking the rewards, while the people who did the actual work paid the price with their health and their careers. I knew the risk of sending the report, but the truth had been buried in the archives for too long. It was time for the numbers to speak, and I was ready to stand by them no matter what happened next. Before the sun had even cleared the horizon over the Seattle skyline, I was already sitting at my desk. The offices were quiet, the long corridors lit only by the emergency lights. I had the external drive in my hand, along with a folder of printed documents. Slowly the building began to fill. I could hear the doors opening, the low murmur of voices, and the quiet rustle of people settling into their seats. George Miller Guther arrived early, too. He was wearing his best suit, but he could not hide the twitch in his left hand, or the way his eyes kept darting toward my cubicle. The meeting room was packed by 9 in the morning. The big screen at the front of the room read, Operations and Financial Review. George took the stage first, trying to capture the narrative before anyone else could speak. He talked about our quarterly numbers, our projected growth, and the hard work of his team. His voice was steady, but I watched his fingers grip the edges of the podium until his knuckles went white. Then Sean O'Neill stood up. He did not raise his voice, but the entire room went dead silent. "We need to talk about transparency," Sean said, nodding toward the technician. The screen flickered, and the slides showing George's growth charts disappeared. In their place, a spreadsheet appeared. It showed 3 transactions to Summit Consulting Group, $145,000, $130,000, and $95,000. Below the figures was the approval log, showing George Miller's electronic signature, and then the screen showed the network access logs from 11:42 in the evening, listing George's user account deleting the audit directories. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the rain tapping against the glass windows. George's face went pale. He stepped toward the microphone, his voice cracking. "This is a technical error," he stammered. "A system glitch. A system glitch does not log in at midnight to delete files," George Sean said, his voice cold and steady. "And it does not authorize payments to a consulting firm that has no physical address, no employees, and no contract." Sean looked at the assembly, then spoke clearly. Under the revised Code of Washington, Section 23B.08.300, every director and manager of this corporation owes a strict fiduciary duty of loyalty and good faith to the company and its shareholders. Diverting $370,000 to a shell corporation for personal enrichment is a direct violation of that statute. It is not just a policy breach, it is a violation of state law. 2 security guards walked into the room and stood quietly near the exit, their presence confirming that this was no longer just an internal company matter. "We are suspending George Miller from his duties immediately, pending the outcome of a full forensic audit and legal proceedings," Sean announced. His voice was steady and carried the weight of finality. George looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to defend him or offer a sympathetic look, but every single head was turned away. The colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes and agreed with his demands were now staring down at their notebooks or looking out the window. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, shock, and defeat. I did not look away. I just met his gaze and gave him a quiet, firm nod. As George was escorted out of the room, his briefcase clutched tightly under his arm. A few people in the back began to clap. Within seconds, The applause spread across the entire room. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was a collective sigh of relief. Scene turned back to the crowd. Effective immediately, Logan Vance will assume the role of Interim Director of Strategic Operations. He has spent 8 years keeping this department running, and he is the one who brought these facts to light. After the meeting, my coworkers came by my desk, offering handshakes and quiet words of congratulations. Claire Jenkins and Duncan Davies both walked over, nodding in quiet appreciation. For the first time in 8 years, I felt like I was actually being seen. By the end of the day, I was sitting in the corner office. I had not moved George's things out yet, but I had my laptop open on the desk. The system had already been updated, showing my name as the administrator for the operations database. I looked out the window at the rain. The clouds were starting to break, and a thin sliver of late afternoon sun was cutting through the gray sky. My phone buzzed with a message from Sean. "Good work today, Logan. Let's build something honest." I put the phone down and smiled. I thought of my father, Walter Vance, and his belief that hard work done in silence eventually finds its way to the light. The fight was not over, but the air in this office finally felt clean.